How are you all? Good? So always very much, for a Tibetan at least, all these years, I've always been very impressed with people working hard through the whole week and then spending the weekend in Dharma activities, practicing, and sort of spending more time in either your Dharma centers or in your own homes, but practicing more. That's always very impressive, and it's very nice that you dedicate yourself to the path of practice, which is very, very good. And on the same hand, yesterday I was thinking about your question the whole night yesterday. Something about, we spoke within the context of working in a Dharma center, but let's look at it a little bit out of that. I often hear in the West this word called burnout. Yesterday we spoke about it. And last night I was thinking, do Western practitioners think that at a certain point you can experience, what do you think? Can you experience burnout syndrome by being on the path of bodhisattvas? Can you experience burnout being kind? What do you think? Shouldn't, but be realistic. It's not only in the West, sometimes even in the Eastern Sanghas, we often have moments where people feel, I wouldn't say, there are different ways to relate to the term burnout, but exhausted being of service to somebody, exhausted being kind, exhausted being Buddhist, exhausted being, a sort of extreme tiredness where you think that it's too much, it's taking toll on your health and your mental stability and so forth. And if you think carefully, I think in today's time especially, people can begin to think that way. It's a whole language and the current stream of how the world functions. And also so much emphasis today in the modern culture about being true to your emotions and being true to how you're feeling and your sensations. And that's a very nice echo for the ego mind and the lazy ego mind that is there is, listen to yourself. So it's all very good. You should listen to yourself and you should explore your inner feelings and your emotions. There's no harm in doing that. Some people really go to the extreme of suppressing what you feel, particularly how your body feels, how your mental health feels. This is not right. But on the other hand, the other extreme is where you are too involved in listening to it and analyze too much. And an analysis that is often done without wisdom. And an analysis that is always catering to the whims of one's habitual tendencies and one's own ego-grasping mind, which leads a person to feeling very mixed up. You do not get the right answer, but you feel very mixed up. And that often can lead to a situation, and then combined together culturally, the modern society today, which not only talks about talking to self and listening to yourself and emotions or sort of exaggerating the needs of your emotions, but also there are many self-help kind of methods that are applied. Some are very good, but most of them, what does happen is we begin to have a dominance of easy ways to do things that caters to the whims of the ego and to your own emotions. Easy way to do this, easy way, 5 steps to doing that, 7 steps to doing this, 10 steps to doing that, 3 steps to good health, isn't it? And so easy, quick, simple steps, we begin to sort of, that whole culture and the influence seeps into also path of practice. And of course, Buddhist path of practice is a lifelong struggle. If it's one lifetime, that's very fortunate, isn't it? And there's very little immediate results that you see. It's a lifelong process of having to develop all the sort of qualities and mindfulnesses and awarenesses, and never a moment of actually being separate from that. So your whole life has to be in tune and permeating with the meaning, with the teachings, with the essence of the teachings. And that often, I think, influences the mind into thinking, this is too hard for me. It is too much for me. It is something that I cannot do. The other question I was thinking about was about feeling discouraged. And we talked about that also. And so such questions of disappointment with your effort, or not seeing the result, or being discouraged by not seeing the transformation and transcendence of one's own self. Sometimes we look at our own selves and we don't find the change, and then we get very upset. Sometimes we don't find the change in the others, and that also upsets us. But all of this often comes to a point where we do feel very tired or exhausted, whether we call it burnout or not. But we do come to a point where we begin to think of Dharma as something to do, something to apply, rather than to be. And then when you apply Dharma, you begin to separate life, normal life, daily normal life, with Dharma practices. And that's, I think, what leads to a sense of exhaustion. Exhausted and tired of being good, exhausted and tired of being kind, exhausted and tired of being the patient one, which leads to other factors that you don't want to be the one who loses. There's a sense of injustice. And often people say, as a Buddhist, you begin to develop a very passive attitude towards your own self. And because of which you become like a doormat, and people run over you, take advantage of you. Where do you draw the lines between selfless giving and idiot compassion? If you explore this question, the question itself comes up because we want to be kind, that's not the point. But we do not want to be kind at the cost of my losing. And in the same way, when we are patient and tolerant, oftentimes we are patient and tolerant, but there's a certain amount of environment that we don't want others to invade. As long as that is protected and that is not being invaded, then we often are able to practice Dharma in daily life. We are kind, we are generous, we are selfless, but to a certain limitation. We never allow a certain amount of all barriers to be completely broken open where there's nothing but complete giving. And so we have been talking about, let's say, our teachers who in their lives, you rarely see them say no, or they're completely open. Shantideva says, life of a person practicing bodhicitta should be like a tree who offers its shadow to everyone, should be like the surface of the earth that can be tread upon by anyone, should be like the flowing river that never has any bias or partiality about how the water is used and who uses the water, where the water flows, or how it is contained, or in what container it is going into. Such a level of practicing kindness, where it's completely sky-like kindness, open and pervasive and limitless for everyone at all times, that's something that we find very difficult to do. And we'll find it very difficult to do because there's always a creation of a space or boundary that we have. So much is what my ego, and depending upon how big the ego is, you always have, sometimes it's bodily, as much as the bodily is confined. Sometimes it may be as big as this room. Sometimes that protection boundary that you do not want others to invade may be as big as the city, or it may be as big as this country, or as this continent, or the world itself. But depending upon how big the ego's needs and demands are, you do create a boundary around yourself, a kind of a wall around yourself. Beyond the wall, if no one interferes what is inside and within the wall, then you are available. Idea of selflessness suits you. Idea of compassion is something very good. Bodhicitta is also very nice. Enlightenment and selflessness is very good. You realize grasping is the key reason why all the causes of suffering arises. But from inside the wall, within the wall and into your own mind, that you sort of hide behind yourself. You don't want to deal with it at this moment. That creates separation. Your inner self and the world that you relate to becomes two different things. When those are two different things, you're not really allowing Dharma to grow within you. You are then becoming theistic. You're becoming adherers to a view, adherers to a philosophy, adherers to a doctrine, but not necessarily living the doctrine. When you don't live that doctrine, then everything becomes applied. Dharma becomes applied actions, applied Dharma, applied view. And that application often will be none other than action. Then you will begin to say things like, I have to do Dharma. Dharma becomes something to do, something that you force yourself to do. You have to make time to do. You have to exert an energy, more energy, sort of a conscious energy to actually accomplish that Dharma. That kind of application or the action aspect of the Dharma, when you relate to Dharma in that way, leads to exhaustion. That is where then you find tired of being kind. And the fear comes in that your kindness may be misused. or that the kindness is not used in the proper way. The demands and expectation of the kindness comes. Grasping to the idea of kindness comes about. And so whilst in the beginning stages, such an approach of applied Dharma may be permissible, it is fine. But ultimately, for a person of greater potential, yesterday that we talked about, lesser and the middle potential, ultimately for a person of greater potential, one begins to see that that kind of applied Dharma is certainly not going to lead to the fulfillment of the second noble truth. Cessation of the cause of suffering is not going to happen at that point. And so what happens is when the middling potential that we have been talking about, that foremost of all understands and reflects upon the first two noble truth of suffering and the cause of suffering, comes to a point where you have to begin to question your own faith, question your own belief. It's a very crucial moment. Usually that moment is where you take refuge. And so people often say, when do I take refuge? You take refuge in between the first two and the third and the fourth noble truth. You realize noble truth of suffering and the cause of suffering. Now, whether you want to find the cessation and walk the path that leads to the cessation or not is the determining factor, where you have to look into your own self and say, oh yes, now you identify what happiness is, what could be the real nature of a human being that has the power of over karma, that it's your actions of body, speech, and mind, and therefore you can steer karma into creating only happiness. You can do that. But on the other hand, you also realize the relentless flow of habitual tendencies that do not always work the way that you want it to be. And then you begin to come face to face with this enormous inability to steer, although all actions are your actions. It's your body's actions. And logically speaking, how can you not have any control over your own body's actions? How can you not have control over the speech that you make? And it's your mind. And there's nobody who can have better control over the mind than your own self. And therefore, what are the reasons? What is the reason that does not allow you to have the ability to tame your own actions of body, speech, and mind? And so two things come very close. Karma is created, it's my karma, and at the same time, how much of that karma is under my power, under my control. And therefore, that leads to a much more closer glimpse of seeing happiness and the possibility of creating ground of happiness, and yet the suffering, which is none other than the inability to create happiness and the cause of happiness, and in most times creating the opposite, suffering and causes of different kinds of suffering, not only for oneself, but for the others. Then you have to sort of look into your own mind and say, are you going to do something about it or not? The difference between Siddhartha, Buddha Shakyamuni, before he became Buddha, and ourselves is that moment that we come where you have to make a decision. Are you going to be free from this mark of ignorance, of having a body, not having a body at the same time? Your speech, not having any control over your speech, and having a mind and yet never being able to have a mind. And a crazy person who is very proud of the fact that you have no control at all, isn't it? And so are you going to be content living that life of ignorance? Or are you going to do something about it, which any normal person, sensible person would say is, as a human being, you would do? How many times do we tell our children, get a life, isn't it? Grow up, be mature. We go to school to try and become mature people. We find jobs, we try to become independent and self-reliant to do that. This whole country is about freedom, isn't it? And so if that freedom is what one really wants, if you really want that sense of freedom to be able to use your own body, speech, and mind according to the aspiration of happiness that we all spend our whole life doing, what is it that we do? Ever since we wake up in the morning to the time that we fall into sleep, it's work so that you can have happiness. We keep ourselves busy all the time searching for that elusive happiness so that we don't encounter another difficult moment, another painful, suffering moment. If that is what we are doing, then at that moment, can you really walk a path, no matter how challenging and difficult it may be, to really find cessation of the cause of suffering and walk the path that leads to the cessation? If you do, and when you choose, that's where we then take on refuge. We take refuge with the sole purpose that I am going to find truth of the cessation, a path, walking the path, so that leads to the cessation of this madness of the ignorant mind that creates an unceasing amount of suffering and causes of suffering. So when that genuine wish to really find cessation of suffering comes about, then it's very easy at that time to say, just as I want, other sentient beings also want. So if this effort leads to the cessation of suffering of all sentient beings, what could be better? And that motivation is what needs to be carried on into all aspects of your life. When that motivation of finding cessation of suffering and genuine happiness for oneself and for all sentient beings is the ground basis upon which you then find your spiritual path of practice. Whether it is shamatha, you find it on that motivation. Whether it is any kind of meditation or receiving teachings or Vajrayana, Mahayana, Hinayana practices, whichever levels of practices that you do, but that you find it on the foundation of understanding the value and the easiness of happiness and cause of happiness, and yet always this being sort of obstructed because of our own karmic tendencies, therefore finding a path that leads to the cessation of this ignorant tendency. When that is the main motivation, then you begin to actually have a much more direct and a correct, genuine, more pure aspect of a relationship with Dharma practice. So when you sit on a cushion, when you meditate, the whole purpose, you have to say, the motivation is happiness, cause of happiness for myself and the others, freedom from suffering and the causes of suffering for oneself and for the others. This is the only purpose with which I meditate. This is the purpose with which I enter a path of spiritual practice, call it Buddhism or any other contemplation. But this is the main purpose. When that intention is cultivated within one's own mind, and that becomes the single point of motivation, such a moment is where meditators then take all aspects of life as Dharma practices. Not only those that are designed as methods of practices, but all aspects. Because you begin to also come with a mind that knows all actions must transcend into becoming that which is a cause of happiness and freedom from suffering. And so rather than the applied way of Dharma, at such a point, the meditator begins to have an understanding that meditation means transcending all karmas. Since all karmas can become cause of suffering, likewise all karmas can also become cause of happiness. And therefore, training the mind wherever karma is created in order that everything permeates as Dharma practices then begins to be understood. And so every moment of your breath. And so yesterday I was speaking with someone here during a personal audience, and she was telling me, I've begun to realize that every moment is practice. Every out-breath is practice, every in-breath is practice, every blinking is practice, every moment I speak is practice, every gasp is a practice. And that's good. That's a good meditator beginning to understand that transcendence and transformation from samsara to nirvana entails transcending and transformation of all karma, all activities. All activities must become Dharma. And so to think that there's a moment, and people often say, this is my meditation practice, what should I do in my post-meditation? Isn't it? And when you ask a question, you usually can give a nice answer and you say, well, in post-meditation, maybe you should think about the guru. Or in post-meditation, maybe you could just think of a seed syllable. Or post-meditation, just train on a slogan or something. If you ask a question, you always get one answer or the other. But the actual fact is that if you're asking such a question, you haven't understood meditation at all. Because you're separating life from Dharma. And with that, there is no solution. There's a temporary relief, definitely. Temporary relief and some good karmas. And the choice is entirely yours. Some good karma, some causes of happiness, some dissolution of suffering and causes of suffering, or cessation of suffering and pervasive happiness. Isn't it? And if it is pervasive happiness that we all aspire, and that is the fact, that is what motivates us, and then in that case, then you'll have to see how much Dharma needs to permeate within every moment. Each moment that we think, we must think as a meditator. Each moment that we speak, we must speak as a meditator. Each moment that we act must be that of a meditator. Anyone who is unable to gradually cultivate a potential where every moment of your life is nothing but the fragrance of Dharma, the permeation of the Dharma and the essence of Dharma is not being permeated, will always have to struggle with duality. There's always going to be that struggle. And so in comparison to not doing anything good, I've always said doing some good is always good. But having come to so much, having given up so much, having worked hard so much to come here to this point in your life, you can do much better. And that's discovering the highest potential in yourself, where you have to ask yourself the question, why cannot every moment of my life be led sanely, as a human being should? Then that comes as, oh yes, this is the cessation that can actually cease all the causes of suffering. But without a path, we often find it very difficult to even make a beginning. And so the Mahayana teachings talk about various things. For example, paramitas. How many paramitas are there? From a philosophical perspective, every fraction of a second, if a second can be divided into 60 parts, each part of that second is said to be able to be divided further into 60 more parts. And in each of these, you can have 60 emotions, flittering emotions. So in sort of keeping it very simple is, in a millisecond, you can have 60 karmas, minimum. You can create that much. Therefore, antidote-wise, you would also have 60 paramitas per millisecond, if you look carefully in that way. So when you say paramita practice, it simply is perfection. What is paramita? Is perfection. Perfection of every moment of your life that is led in such a way that it becomes nothing but a cause of happiness for oneself and for the others. But sentient beings, when we hear this, we often find that although it is very true and some part of our mind can intellectually understand this, but it overwhelms us. And we begin to think, oh, but that is being too aware. It's too much. It's asking too much. I cannot do that. So I think kindness of great bodhisattvas, particularly Shantideva, sums it up. Nagarjuna and Shantideva sums it up into 6 paramitas. And then we think, oh, this is very easy. There are only 6 things that I need to do. However, the skill of the great bodhisattvas is that nothing is left that is not accounted for within these 6 aspects of the paramitas. If you look at generosity, ethics, patience, diligence, meditation, and wisdom, these are the 6 paramitas, and all of Buddhists know how to sort of enumerate these. If you look carefully and you explore this very vast topic, you will find that actually it goes into, if you are careful in observing these 6 principles or 6 paramitas, it takes care of all these 60 fractions of every moment. And it doesn't leave any gaps for our habitual tendencies to come back and again turn the mind into the display of ignorance. Therefore, highest capacity, here Chögyam in his commentary of the Asanga's teachings talks about really contemplating on the 6 paramitas and applying the 6 paramitas throughout your day, throughout your life, so that every moment of your living life or living moments become nothing other than the expression of 6 paramitas. When you begin to practice the 6 paramitas in a genuine and a very direct way, one begins to then really find 2 main aspects. One is, how far are you able to really stand true to the hope and the aspiration of finding cessation of suffering for yourself and for the other sentient beings? And secondly is, because it is in connection with the discussion on potential, therefore, how authentic is your potential? How authentic is your actions of the body, speech, and mind that is in accordance to the view that you have maintained in your life, which is the most important factor, is that it challenges yourself to say, I always do, whenever we practice paramitas, oftentimes you come to a moment where you have to face yourself and say, well, I've practiced Dharma for so many years. I thought I was a Vajrayanist. I thought I knew about the true nature of thoughts. I thought I actually was labeling, dropping, knowing about self-grasping tendencies and sort of trying to look at the nature of my own thoughts and my own mind. But here it is, an act of generosity and the storyline that goes episode after episode after episode, where you can't forget someone not saying thank you to you for being kind, isn't it? Or ethics becomes such a big issue. And so generally, normally if we talk about the paramitas, usually I try to experiment with students. For example, they don't seem to have problems with any of the paramitas except when we come to the ethics issue. And there's always in a room, there are people that you can figure out and find out to whom you can target a certain thing. And so you use your tone to say something such as, without monasticism, there will be no Dharma. And suddenly there will be a big issue about Trungpa Rinpoche said, no, you should be householders, and this is not the modern times, and everyone is not a Tibetan, and how can we be this, and what do I do with my husband, and what do I do with my wife, and isn't it unkind to leave my family and my jobs behind, and so on. So there's a massive argument that will immediately come about, which is not the point actually. The point is where someone is saying, give up alcohol. The whole point comes down to that. Give up sexual misconduct, isn't it? Give up drugs, for example. And that attacks you. And that's the whole point of paramitas, is that how did you ever imagine that you could get non-grasping mind by grasping to certain things? Isn't it? And so one has to challenge oneself. We're not saying challenge today. If you're not capable of doing it today, that's fine. But there should be at some point in your mind that you're going to be challenged about it. You're going to be challenged about your beauty, your wealth, your love affairs, your sexual desires, your grasping to, let's say, whatever. I'm going to be challenged with my belief. I'm going to be challenged that this is the path that I think is the right way. I'm going to be challenged with my great love and attachment to my lineage, to my what I think is right and wrong, and my own views and principles and so forth. Ultimately, I'm going to have to be challenging myself to say, you have to give up being you and everything that it entails. But meditators, when we forget this, when we don't think about this, then we become narrow-minded. The tunnel vision begins to develop. And like the disease, where you begin that sort of narrow-mindedness and tunnel vision, it becomes smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and then we think generosity is about, should I give up my $1 or shouldn't I give up my $1? And that becomes the whole issue, isn't it? Ethics becomes the beautiful postcards of monks and nuns beating drums or playing the cymbals or something like that. Oh, beautiful ethics, isn't it? And you take photographs and then you hang them on the wall, and that's the ethics there. Patience becomes, I'm not going to talk to anybody. And so those sort of very small childishness comes about in one's own path of practices. And then we say, Mahayana mind. I'm a Mahayana mind. I'm going to liberate all sentient beings. And then when someone says, instead of $1, can you give 10? Then we have burnout. So it's very essential to sit down and to think carefully about one's own relationship. This last few talks that we have been talking about, it's your life. You have to think. The gift and the preciousness and the profoundness of the path of the practices that we have, you have to think into what kind of a mind are you pouring the teachings? Are you holding the teachings? That mind is the one that is going to be the creator of happiness that we wish for ourselves and we wish for the others. It is that mind that aspires to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering for oneself and for the others, and it has to work a lot harder than we are doing at this moment. And therefore, here in the beginning it says, as Asanga himself has said, in order to attain enlightenment, if we are supposed to give up our life without any regret or any second thoughts, then giving up a few other things that are simple to give, you don't have to even think about that. And so, therefore, a person who really understands the enormous power of karma, actions and activities, should have no problem in understanding what generosity truly means. And if you look at Shakyamuni Buddha's life himself, and we find at least he accounts for at least 1,000 lifetimes where at every moment in his prime of his life, he gave his life in order to benefit another sentient being, without any doubt, without any hesitation. And then subsequently, after 1,000 lifetimes, and at the time when he attained enlightenment, there's an excerpt in his biography which says, when the Mara asks him, how can you prove that you have actually been worthy of realization? What have you actually done to attain realization? And touching the earth as the witness, he says, if every particle, dust, or the earth of the surface of the earth were made into small pellets the size of a pea, it would run out of earth if it would be, each pellet would represent the number of times I've given my life for the benefit of sentient beings. And that story or anecdote is something that Buddhists need to keep in mind. Ultimately, when we say generosity, what should a Buddhist generosity be is that one who doesn't think about giving up one's life if it can truly be of help to another person. The readiness with which you can be generous at any time, going beyond limitations, going beyond your own pretentiousness of this fabricated ego's boundary, and being ready always to be generous and kind at all times, that's the foremost practice that any Buddhist should be practicing. Much more important than mantras, much more important than this creation and completion that everyone seems to be so very fond of. Isn't it? That's all very nice, that's all very good, that's a different topic. But on the other hand, that's not the purpose with which we become Buddhists. We become Buddhists to be at readiness, to be generous at any time, whatever moment. And if giving up life should be something that be easy for any practitioner of a Buddhist who understands the vast merit of generosity and this becoming a cause of freedom from suffering of another sentient being and the purification of one's own karma, then giving up of small moments of ego shouldn't be difficult. Accepting defeat shouldn't be difficult. Losing arguments shouldn't be difficult. Saying something, not saying something, and sort of becoming more, practicing humility, practicing a sense of letting the others win shouldn't be very difficult. Giving up something so that someone can benefit shouldn't be very difficult. Furthermore, in the text it says, "Changchu chenpo zobe sanje tobe chir, demba cherab le songba tarsong. Lu rupo tongwa chimba parolin, chimbe drove rekong hijin sernin duba chebe choncha chosong." Generosity is nothing other than giving. And the opposite factor of it is stinginess. Serna, we say in Tibetan. Serna is stinginess, miserliness. Stinginess about everything. Stinginess about praising another person. It's not only about material wealth. Stinginess about being helpful to another person. Stinginess about passing cushions from one person to the other person. Sometimes I sit here and I watch, and there are moments where somebody walks in and looks for a chair. And then there's sometimes a kind person who goes and looks for a chair and comes back or shares a cushion. Sometimes in some Dharma centers you find everyone, no, I must listen to what is paramita of generosity. I cannot be disturbed. But speaks a lot. There is no moment of escaping. There is no moment where you can relax and pretend that this is not the moment where you practice the Dharma. And so in our retreat centers, for example, there is someone called the retreat attendant. And I heard about this. I didn't directly hear it, but I heard from other students, is that when in Rumtek, when the 3-year retreat center was set up, and many of the monks went into retreat, the 3-year-long retreat, the retreat houses normally 8 people or so. And there's always one attendant to the retreatant. He's responsible for cooking and shopping and bringing the things and throwing the torma outs and so forth. And it is said that the 16th Kamapa, Jawa Kamapa, had said that every attendant who finishes a 3-year retreat actually acquires 100 times more merit than the retreatant themselves. And that's how it is. So what is practice, after all? Sitting on a cushion and then mumbling something, you have to always ask that question. What is it? Very oftentimes people will say, I have no time to practice, I have no time to practice, especially when you are in the service area. And I've never seen our teachers say they have no time to practice. And yet these are the people who work the hardest. His Holiness, when we had the opportunity to serve them, they would wake up at 3:30, in the morning, see hundreds of people through the day, give transmissions, empowerments, teachings. They wouldn't have time to eat. Even when they were eating, they would be reading texts and teaching somebody, and had in brief moments, they would put something in their own mouth and then teach others, teach others, teach others. If there were some small gaps, then they would be doing some recitation or looking or whatever it is, but a seamless day of working, very hard working, and yet never in their life will you find a moment where they've said, I have no time to practice. But you and I always do that, isn't it? We have no time to practice, and then we have to make these small half-an-hour sittings, and then we ready everything, and we have to have all this paraphernalia that has to be set up there. And there's something that's really not seen very much. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who can be more busy than him? Isn't it? But he still says, I study 4 hours a day. And you wonder, where does he find the time? Where does he really find the time? You look at the biographies of the great masters, and if you look at any great master, for example, if you look at Tedak Lingpa, if you look at Lochen Damashri, if you look at Longchen Pa, Jigme Lingpa, Khandro Rinpoche, in their biographies, what I find always fascinating is, especially when you look through their collection of works, you'll find when it is referring to initiations that they received, and you know that they've lived 60 years, 40 years, 70 years, or whatever it is, and you look at the list of initiations they've received, it almost seems like they were doing nothing but receiving initiations. Then in their biography, when you look at how many compositions they made, it looks like they were doing nothing but composing. Then if you look at how much they were traveling and teaching, it looks like nothing but they were traveling and teaching all the time. Then if you look at how many empowerments and things that they were giving to the Sanghas, it looks like they were spending all the time empowering and giving transmissions to them. Then if you look at how many established monasteries they built, it looks like they were constructing all the time, isn't it? And so you'd wonder how they did it. But that kind of a situation of seamless practice is where you never separate your breathing moments with Dharma at any moment. You take every moment as practice, everything you say as mantra, every moment that you are with your body as the posture in meditation. And mind in meditation is mind in meditation. Wherever there is awareness, there is mind in meditation. If you're able to understand the essence of the paramitas, permeating in every breath you take, every blinking of, every moment your eye blinks, every breathing moment that you have, one begins to then gradually have a sense of what it means to be a practitioner, a Dharma meditator at all times. At such a moment, this whole separation of meditation, post-meditation, formal meditation, that doesn't happen. In any case, if you look carefully, this whole structure that we have, I don't have time to practice, I don't have time to practice, this often comes where you are seeing practice as that, what Trungpa Rinpoche called so beautifully, the cocoon that you make for yourself. It's that nest hibernating. Jamgon Khandro Rinpoche's Creation Completion has one of the favorite phrases that I like very much, and he says, meditators who resemble a gopher hibernating. Isn't it? Wonderful example. We all build that little nest called the red cushion, Zafus and Zabutans, isn't it? And we nest over there and we escape from life. We escape from being a human being. And where that kind of a separation happens, gentle heart and a genuine heart of bodhicitta never is cultivated. We do practice kindness, of course. It's not saying that we don't do it all. Some little goodness and some little acts of generosity and patience and kindness and meditation, we definitely develop. But when you come in contrast to the karma, as I said, doesn't compromise. It doesn't see and sort of is not partial to you because of your hopes and fears. And therefore, the seed that you sort of sow, if it is feeble, if it is weak, if it is tainted with selfishness, with laziness, with separation and duality, then fruition of that karma is going to be in accordance to the seed that you have planted. And then you wonder why the Dharma is not fruitioning in your own self, why realization is so elusive. And we look at the stories of the past of the great masters, and we hear people when they received teachings from the great masters, and at the end of the session, they soared in the sky and flew and attained realization immediately. We hear about teachers pointing out instruction, and the students hearing it completely. And we wonder why that doesn't happen anymore. It doesn't happen anymore because we are gophers hibernating all the time. The container within which the teachings are going is into a mind that has only that much of a capacity. An ocean may be poured into a person's heart, but if the heart is only the size of a cup, the ocean has to then fill in a cup, isn't it? Likewise, therefore, generosity or bodhicitta, heart of enlightened awakening, enlightened compassion, has to really permeate within one's own mind. Therefore, in the beginning here, Chujitaba says, practice kindness at all times, practice generosity at all times. Beginning with the three foremost of the givings or generosities. First is giving of material wealth. Meditators must understand the importance of dana, importance of generosity of material wealth. Second is generosity of Dharma, something that I think has been very, very misunderstood. And so material wealth, many times people just jump over, isn't it? Oh, that's right, that's very correct. And they make a small donation. But when it comes to the generosity of Dharma, then everyone wants to teach these days. So I think I always joke about this a little bit, is that before anyone practices these days, everyone's jumping into teaching, isn't it? People come and receive teachings and they say, can you please teach me on this text, because this is a text I'd really like to teach somebody else. A few years ago, not very long ago, we used to receive teachings to practice them. Nowadays, we receive teachings to teach others immediately, isn't it? I'd like to translate this and then make a book out of it. And so the whole concept of Dharma these days changes. Then third, generosity, minjik bachapti chimba, and that is generosity or giving of fearlessness or freedom from fear. In the beginning, as a meditator developing, if you really have a sense of happiness and wanting happiness, not wanting suffering for yourself and for all sentient beings, how to accomplish that, how to purify karma, how to steer the karma so that the karma is under your control, is to first practice with the first generosity, paramita of generosity, called generosity of material wealth. And so here, Chujitaba says in a very direct way, think about how many animals you've fed. Material wealth is that. If you've given food to even one hungry animal, that's wonderful practice. That's the practice of generosity. So far superior than sitting and giving sun and the moon and the stars and the four continents and things that do not belong to you. Isn't it? Inexpensive ways. You flick a few grains of rice, and these days people are even stingy about that. And people argue about the wisdom behind Buddhists throwing so much rice on the floor. It could feed so and so many people and so forth. And so, in a way, it talks a lot about our mind. It's all training the mind. There is never a moment where you are not facing a situation where you're not working with your mind, where you're not taming and training your mind. As a meditator, therefore, look into yourself and see kindness and generosity in action, true action. How many sentient beings have I really fed? How many people have I given money to? Have I given food? Have I given shelter? Have I given clothing to wear? And so here Chujitaba says, what are you going to do? Hug very tightly all your material belongings until the moment you die? Are you going to live a life of that kind of a meditator? Isn't it? And if you your money purse and your bank books and your credit card and your car and your house and your clothing and so forth, and you hug them tightly and you hold, no matter how tightly you hold, how many years are we going to live anymore anyway? And what are we going to do with it? I look into my own life and I find, as I was joking the other day, I said, I've come to a point in my life where I'm not much in any place, isn't it? So the lifestyle that I have is primarily I live in a suitcase. The suitcase wherever I go. But even so, I don't have a house. I don't have any permanent place to live in. If I had, at least then that would say this is a place to keep things. But where a person doesn't have a house and doesn't have a sort of any place to keep anything, even for such a person, the amount of things I have today, it takes about 6 people to lug the things every 3 days from one place to the other place. That's the kind of things we accumulate. And what are we going to do? What am I going to do with that number of things? Khandro Rinpoche often used to say, His Holiness was one of the perfect examples of never having taken anything. He did not have anything. When he left Tibet, he left with 3 dogs. That was all he took. And up to this time, into this time, he never owns anything, doesn't have anything at all to his own name. And so if you look carefully, he would always say, what are you going to do with it? 1 body, how many clothings? Isn't it? 1 little stomach, how much food? And you look into our homes and you find it's that 1 stomach, but if you look at our cabinets, it's full of things. If you look at only the number of spices we have, isn't it? Then you look at the number of condiments we have, number of things the clothing that we have, the slippers that we have, the shoes that we have, cars that we have, houses that we have. It's an amount of things, and yet it is the same person who says things like, we need to feed the poor people. We need to clothe the poor people. As Buddhists, as those who really are working with generosity, how much in your life do you take time to give to another person? Yesterday, after we left with the evening talk yesterday, some of the nuns were talking about their grandparents and how they would go to buy. If they went to buy tsampa, the barley flour that Tibetans eat, the custom was always, if they bought 10 kilos, they would leave 5 kilos to give to somebody else, and then 5 kilos they would keep for themselves. That's the traditional custom that even lay people practiced in Tibet. Nowadays, we don't do that, isn't it? We talk about breathing out all the light and compassion and well-being and health and material wealth, and my breath then become the food for the others, may my breath become the clothing for the others. But when it comes to acquiring, there's so much of exertion of effort in acquiring for the self, a self that doesn't need anymore. But in terms of generosity to the others, hardly. We do not do anything. How many times have you gone shopping only to give to others? Isn't it? And so, thinking very carefully in this way, as a meditator, one must look into one's own self, contemplate, analyze in one's own self, and see there might be a discrepancy between view and action. Where is your view and what is your action? If the view and the action are not in accord with one another, what kind of a fruition can you expect? After such a fruition does come about, then one shouldn't complain about karma. Isn't it? So, cessation of suffering and the path that leads to the cessation is dependent upon view and action being unified. So that what you aspire for, you want to go in a particular direction, then you have to begin to walk that particular direction. Challenges are there, but in order to achieve that goal, in order to achieve that fruition, one's actions must be in accordance, one's motivation and action must be in accordance with what it is that you want to fruition or obtain as a result. Two things that are very essential here, and particularly because it comes from the teachings of Asanga over here. It says, for general lay people, generosity of material wealth is an immensely important practice. And for those who have begun to walk the path, especially monastics, for example, contentment with what you have and not wanting more is one of the most important practices, practice of generosity. And so these two are integral practices. Furthermore, then again, generosity of Dharma, making it possible for others to receive teachings, receive abhishekas and empowerments, receive transmissions, be able to meet with Dharma, and through that bring about fruition of their precious human existence. If one can be generous in providing others the gift of Dharma, then that is again said to be one of the perfect acts of generosities. It has to be carefully understood that until you are able to completely overcome self-grasping mind, to try and achieve the accomplishment for the others is going to be very difficult. This is something very important to understand. Many people think about being compassionate to the other sentient beings. But to be compassionate to other sentient beings, one has to foremost of all work with your own self. First, train your own mind. Train your mind that it can be free from self-grasping tendencies, which is essential in that if the self-grasping tendency is not tamed, There will always be an agenda in your compassion. There will be an agenda in your teaching. There will be an agenda to any acts of generosity that you accomplish, which always then leads to confusion or some kind of expectation. Even earlier, the burnouts and so forth that we usually encounter these days often happens where people tend to impart teachings before one has trained one's own self. And that's, again, very true. We often joke about it these days. Recently, I was at a gathering of senior teachers, and Chabja Tushek Rinpoche, one of the great teachers that we have today, was saying, jokingly, but I don't think he really meant it as a joke. He really meant it to be felt as it was felt, I think. And he said, well, in our times, there used to be a time when a teacher would be learning and then would then receive transmissions and teachings, then go into retreats for long periods of times. And closer towards their old age, then they would start manifesting their activities and begin to teach others. But these days, the younger generation of teachers seem to be prepared well in their mother's womb, because because the moment they are born, they begin to teach, isn't it? And so that's also something to think about, is that in our generation, this has been a very unfortunate thing, is that the activities have begun a lot before the practice itself. So much of our teachings, anything that we teach today, is very empty words. It's very different, and that's the unfortunate thing that you all have to face, is to receive teachings from people like ourselves, where it's spoken words, definitely, but it's sort of spoken words as we hear, which is different from spoken words as I've practiced and experienced myself. There's a very big difference in that. So teachers, for example, if you read The Path of Enlightenment of Dinghu Khyentse Rinpoche's biography, if you read this biography, everyone should read Matthew Ricard's book on Dinghu Khyentse Rinpoche's life. And there's a section which shows the cave in which Rinpoche actually sat in meditation for years, I think 13 or 16 years. And in Rinpoche's own words, and many of you have met with Khyentse Rinpoche, so you all know what an enlightened master he is. And so in that way, he says, I made the stove. It's a small cave, maybe 6 by 8 feet. It's just about this round. But he says, I made my stove close to the meditation box so that I didn't waste time going from my meditation seat to the kettle. And so he sat in that way for, I think, 13 years or 6 years or something, it says. And that's how he practiced. And years and years. Jabja Trijang Rinpoche, my father, spent about 19 years in retreat of his life. And in all of this, he says, it was an 8 by 8 room, high enough so that when he got up, his head didn't touch the ceiling, and long enough, his teacher said, so that when he prostrated, it didn't obstruct his body. And he's not a very tall person, isn't it? And so in that way, these teachers practiced, and then they taught. The next generation, those who have taught, began talking a lot before the actual retreat and the practices happened. And that, I think, is one of the marks of the degenerate times. You have to be very careful. And having said that, it is essential to keep in your mind the importance of really practicing Dharma. First, practice it. Genuinely practice it before you teach somebody else, before you actually expect the others to perform the practices. And so, whether teachers or whether students, for all of us, the formal meditation, Chuji Jimba, Dharma, generosity of Dharma is an accomplishment of the practices. One must practice diligently, one must bring sort of exertion of effort in practices. Only when Dharma permeates in your being through the formal meditation, through the practices, can you then really give the generosity of Dharma to other sentient beings that will truly be helpful for other sentient beings. And so I sometimes talk about it myself, and I say, someone like myself, until I go hoarse, you say horse, isn't it? Horse, you speak. And some people are very kind. They say, oh, it helps. So on an optimistic note, I'll say maybe it helps in some ways. But it's very different from when we sat in the presence of our teachers. There's a saying in Hindi, and Nahid, probably you can correct me, so sonar ki ek lohar ki, and 100 hammers of a goldsmith and 1 single strike of an ironsmith. And then the goldsmith sort of has to hammer 100 times. But an ironsmith can come and in one hammer, it can do whatever the job needs to be done. So I find sometimes this proverb or this sort of a saying very true in that we go hoarse trying to say the same thing, and sometimes the same student can be in the presence of our great teachers, and without a single word, that person absolutely understands volumes and volumes without having heard it in words. Now, why does that happen is because of the practice mind. Mind itself becomes the teaching. Bodily, that person becomes the teaching. And that kind of generosity, that's absolute generosity. His Holiness Jawakamapa, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Khandro Rinpoche, Trijang Rinpoche, Dujang Rinpoche, all of these teachers, if you look carefully, without a single word, tames the mind of the person who is in their presence. So much more powerful. Now, if in that way, taking inspiration and encouragement, one has to look into one's own self and say, you have to become someone like that. It's not about he or she, it's about you. If in your heart you have generosity, you don't have to go out to give somebody. Who you are as a kind and a generous person, generosity is felt by the others. You don't have to say something nice to another person. Words do not have to be given for the other person to feel peaceful when they are with you. You do not have to give happiness to another person by being who you are, in your mind, a tamed practitioner practicing generosity and perfection of generosity that can be felt around you. And this is, in small ways, you can experience that too. Among your family members, sometimes you will find that people are just drawn to you a little bit more than they are drawn to, let's say, another person. At those moments, you have to recognize it's not because of anything other than the little bits of practices of kindness that you do. You may be practicing a little more patience, little more kindness, little more generosity, little more care and concern for the others, and that is then what speaks a lot more about bodhicitta. And it's not necessary to say, I'm going to do this act of generosity or practice my bodhicitta this way or that way. Like the sun that shines in the sky, bodhi mind, the mind that is generous, tamed with generosity, permeates that generosity, and that is then called perfect Dharma generosity, where you do not have to teach the other person to be calm. You yourself, exuding the calmness, will bring about the calmness in the environment, where kindness, patience, tolerance, genuine harmony within yourself can be a perfect example that gives out. And therefore, because the Sangha has always been an example of living the Dharma completely, therefore it is one among the three jewels. And therefore, in that way, understanding that through words, through different kinds of actions, through different kinds of speech, definitely, beings. Sixth is then said to be Yöje Mebala Yöje Gitobdam, to help people materially where they are poor, where they are without any help. And so it's true. I think really, I come from India, and therefore I see that. Is this nowadays it's a little bit better because we've been talking about it so much. But a few years ago, charity and being able to give to people in need from Buddhists were very little. Even if you look today, because I connect myself with various charitable things, most of the charitable projects that are run by any Buddhist organization are actually donations received from non-Buddhists. It's not from Buddhist centers. That's a fact. And so anyone who raises funds for poor people, older people, whether it's orphanages, whether it is for any hospitals or schools or for whatever it is, Buddhists never do that because they're so busy buying Buddhist books, isn't it? Buying the best damaru, buying the best bell and dorji, buying those expensive tankas, the statues, the gilded statues, making their shrines, going from one program to the other program, traveling in pilgrimages to Mount Kailash and everywhere else. But when it comes to dana, generosity that feeds the poor people, very seldom. There are some, of course, very good, I'm sure. But in most cases, that is there. There's one project that is called the Deutsche Tibetan Life. It's from Germany. But it has about, I think, 4,000 sponsorships for Tibetan refugees. Out of that, there are 3 Buddhists in that 4,000 sponsorships. The rest are all non-Buddhists and mostly Christians or atheists, those who don't have it. But simple act of kindness, they think it's a kindness. When I grew up, and we were of a generation that faced a lot of difficulties. And so we grew up in absolute poverty, and schooling became very difficult. And so in the earlier parts, of course, half of my year's schooling fees was given by His Holiness 16th Karmapa, and half of my schooling fees was given by Khandro Rinpoche. But after a while, what happened was this Deutsch Tibetan life came up with a sponsorship that would pay for my school fees, my regular English school fees. And I received this sponsorship for about 6 years of my schooling life. This 6 years was a class of 3 graders in Germany, 3rd grade students, who collected pocket money and then sent it to India, and that's how I went to school. Another 2 years that I went to school was by a young man in Germany again, who did every Saturday and Sunday he washed cars. And then he saved that money and then he sent. That's how people are. Kindness is that. Now, what do we do? Isn't it? You have to think very carefully. Big and profound ideologies, but maybe many of you do a lot of acts of kindness. I cannot be too critical at this point. But on the other hand, our view and our mind as it works, we are not able to really practice what is here said, generosity, the ethics of kindness to other sentient beings. Then 7th is said to be chee-tah legbar döba, and that is creating harmony in Sangha. Chee-tah is retinue of Dharma, which simply is Sangha or community. And so, how much effort do you make in bringing harmony in Sangha? How do you relate to the Sangha? Do you relate to it as walk in the door with hellos and walk out the door with goodbyes? Or do you actually feel this is your family? This is where you bring friendship. This is where you bring happiness. This is where you share. This is where you care. This is where you look around. Before coming into a shrine room, do you look around and say, what is needed? What is needed to be done? Before leaving, do you say, can I do something before I leave? In terms of caring, in terms of creating harmony, if there are 2 people arguing, do you add fuel to that argument and make it worse because it can be a topic of good conversation? And most people, I think in Buddhist communities, this is a very big problem, is that we love controversies and scandals because it makes our coffee taste so much better, isn't it? In otherwise our very boring meditator's life, those little bits of controversies that we have, we enjoy them so much because it's that what brings flavor, we think. But we do not understand how much that hurts others, how much that harms others. Backstabbing somebody else, bad-mouthing somebody else, slandering somebody else, creating misunderstandings between 2 people, the self-agenda and self-promotion which competes one person against the other person. Those are the different things that ethically a Buddhist meditator should be very careful not to create in one's own life. Therefore, how much harmony can you create within a Sangha? It is Semtun Jukpa. How much effort do you make in developing the ethics of creating friendship between 2 people? How much time do you spend saying nice thing about this person regarding the other person so that these 2 people can become good friends? How much do you create an environment where everyone can be good friends with one another? These are simple actions that meditators should cultivate within one's own self. Then, as we said about yesterday, the 9th quality that the text mentions here is joyfulness. How joyful a person are you? And why not? Because joyfulness is there if you are happy for others. Joyfulness is not there if you only think about your own self. That's as simple as that. And therefore, practice being happy at the accomplishments and the happinesses of the others. And then here it says, how much effort do you make in annihilating or destroying negativities within your own selves? How often do you correct your own self? Oh, I'm getting angry, I shouldn't. Oh, I'm getting selfish, I shouldn't. Oh, this is not what I should be doing, I shouldn't be doing. How much do you actually destroy or annihilate negativities within your own self? And then 11th, which says, how many miraculous actions do you perform that can tame and subjugate the minds of the others? Now, in regard to the fourth karma, I would say subjugation. This is again one thing. And it's a very interesting section over here, the 11th action that is spoken about within the activities or within the ethics over here. And I was mentioning it to the other people also the other day, is miracles and miraculous actions are very, very, very strange. There have been in the history of Tibetan Buddhism great Mahasiddhas and masters who performed many miraculous activities that have tamed the minds of people who otherwise would never be tamed, probably, isn't it? But this was a topic that we once were talking about in the monastery. And I remember a group of us who were receiving teachings on Guhai Garba from Rinpoche once asked him about miracles and great masters performing miracles. And Rinpoche said, oh yes, miracles are very easy. Those miracles that one does, those are nothing so fascinating, because if you look at magicians, if you look at David Copperfield, for example, it does all these magic tricks that are very easy. But he said, you know, one of the miracles that are there is that, for example, he said, I have never broken any precept, or I've never broken any samaya. That's a miracle, isn't it? That's true. And so in that way, a miracle in today's time would be genuine kindness, never wavering from kindness, never wavering from ethics, never wavering from the commitments that you take. If you say, I'm going to be a kind person, and you never waver from that commitment, there couldn't be a greater miracle than that in today's times. So miracle is going the opposite direction of habitual tendencies. If you've grown up as a human being with a lot of resentment and anger, and you come to a point in your life where you can simply say, I'll drop that anger and be a kinder person, patient person, that's a miracle. That you, in the middle of all these confusions, are a meditator who is today committing yourself to practicing Bodhisattva path of practice, that's a miracle, isn't it? And so miracles must be understood correctly, but a miracle is not a miracle until it benefits somebody else. And so always exert effort. Ethics is exert the effort in creating a miracle so that your family members say, that's a miracle, isn't it? Your Sangha members say, that's a miracle. Sentient beings say, that's a miracle. If you can do that, you would truly be then practicing on the path of ethics. So that is then ethics. And the next is patience. And so I'll just continue with that in the afternoon session.